Thank you, Acting Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Trust Amendment Bill 2024. Now, this bill has been introduced by the government in order to address and reflect changes to the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Trust's operations and remit. It includes the addition of the new convention centre in Geelong under the Trust's administration. Now, these changes have been broadly viewed by the sector as uncontroversial, with the bill necessary to address basic and expected changes to the Trust's operations. However, it doesn't mean there aren't important conversations to have around some of the contents in this bill, the impact it'll have on the sector, and some of the broader contexts of the government's policy. Now, in line with what I've just mentioned, the main provisions of the bill revolve around changing the Trust's name. So it'll change the name of the Trust established by the Principal Act from the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Trust to the Victorian Convention and Event Trust, and this brings it in line with the expanded remit of that trust. It particularly centres around the addition of the Nile Banyul Geelong Convention and Exhibition Centre, which is due to open in 2026, and we know with the track record of this government in opening assets, we don't know if 2026 will be the date, but we all, I guess, hope it will be, especially for the Geelong region and for the events sector. The other noteworthy provisions increase the number of trustees from 7 to 9 and amend the legislation to remove powers from the Governor and Council, and will transfer those powers back to the Minister. And this was described by the government as a measure to get things moving quicker, an expediency measure. All the changes in this bill, though, do contribute to the impact on the stakeholders across the state, both for the better and changes that create a deal of uncertainty as the events industry moves forward into the next phase of its recovery after what has been, or what was, a challenging few years through that COVID period. There are concerns about this bill, though, as I mentioned, and there's definitely a feeling of uncertainty in the community and the industry around how certain changes will directly or indirectly impact them. Now, the event industry in Victoria, it's a big industry. Now, it's made up of the people and the businesses involved in the professional creation and management of special events, both in and from Victoria, and it's an industry responsible for some 120,000 events a year and is worth, in a normal year, over $15 billion to the Victorian economy. It covers things like conferences, exhibitions, brand activations, product launches, incentive programs, charity events, public and community events, festivals, mass participation events, weddings, and of course our major events that we're so proud of here in Victoria and that have been a key piece of what Victoria and what Melbourne is known for by both sides of this house. There's people involved in the events industry, and when you don't just think about our major events, it's a lot more broader than that. There's event companies, conference organisers, exhibition organisers, there's all the people who work in the audio-visual, the theming, the building of the stands, the exhibition rental, the lighting, the audio, the rigging, the staging, the guest management, content creation. It is a very big industry. There's risk managers, production managers, I can keep going, all of the catering, the conferencing. You know, it is a truly huge sector that provides a huge number of jobs to Victorians. And it's important we keep creating a sustainable environment for them to be able to operate in and the best conditions for them to do so. Now, there's also sometimes some confusion, and I think it gets a little bit lost by this current government, that there is a separation between, and even though it does fall in my shadow portfolio and the Minister's portfolio of tourism, sport and major events, there is a big separation between tourism, sport and our events sector, and I think it's just important for us to note that there is that separation. There's a different purpose, there's different economic and operational models, and there's different people, and while there is overlaps in some of those, and some of those jobs that I did mention and those people involved will get involved in some of our major events, but they are also working predominantly in the events sector. Now, the government, in my opinion, only views, and by some of those stakeholders I've spoken to, only views the event industry in terms of hotel room nights, and then some of the trips to other assets around the state that they can deliver, trips down to the Penguins and how it supports the tourism industry. And even though these are byproducts of the industry, in the majority of cases, they are not the main purpose or benefits of the event. And in fact, the vast majority of our events actually have little to no tourism benefits, as they are local events. So they are events held for people here. They're not bringing people necessarily into the city. They are for people here in Victoria or in Melbourne. The event industry is also an export industry, and we export a whole range of products and people to the rest of the world. So, the big events that you see in other states or globally, there are people who are based here in Melbourne, and having a sustainable industry here allows them to also go out and do what they do right around the world. So it is important to know that we need to make sure we're looking after what we do here, so those people can work here, and it's important, but they also are trained and built up to go out and deliver these events globally as well. When we think about events, I think in this place or in this state, we get very, very caught up quite often in photo opportunities, and we think about our major events. And yes, we have a great major events calendar, most of which were handed to this government, and very, very little that they have built on themselves, but things like the Australian Open, the Grand Prix, the Comedy Festival. But these events only make up about just over 5% of the events industry in economic terms. And much of what the government refers to as major events, the art exhibitions at the NGV, theatre productions, actually have little to do with the event industry as a whole. Now, our events drive innovation and change across organisations and community. They educate, they train, they motivate, they bring communities together, and they create social cohesion. They fund and support the work of large proportion of for-purpose organisations, and they give many of their most cherished experiences to people of this state, both socially and economically. And coming out of the last few years, the world has gone through unprecedented change, and these events are probably needed more than ever. Now, it's really hard going in the events industry at the moment. There was little support for this industry through the pandemic period because a lot of the people who work in the industry are self-employed. They didn't have the ability to work during that time. They didn't have necessarily the ability to leave. So we've got to make sure that our organisations like Visit Victoria, Sport and Rec, our Creatives Victoria, they support the tourism, the sports and the arts very well, but we've got to make sure they're also supporting the events sector. Now, on this side of the house, we have a very, very rich and proud history of supporting our events sector and our event venues, including the one mentioned in this bill, the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. And the genesis of the Victorian Government's continual support for these major infrastructure endeavours has focused on making us globally competitive, and that started all back with the Kennett government in the mid-1990s, and we so often hear the Convention Centre referred to as Jeff's Shed. Now, when the Melbourne Exhibition Centre Bill in 1994 was brought before this House, then Minister Goob described it as an opportunity to attract both important Australian and international exhibitions and trade shows to Melbourne. Now, there can be no doubt that we all in this place can agree that it's certainly achieved that mission. It was administered by a department in the government that had a relentless passion to the events sector. It brought trade shows and an expansion of what has become a key industry for Melbourne and Victoria as a whole. It was major reform aimed at supporting that industry, and it was a development that was, and I quote, extremely competitive with modern centres in Sydney, Brisbane, Singapore and Hong Kong vying for an increased market share. And I'm sure everyone can agree that today we are still fighting with those other markets. And I think it's why it is important this new exhibition centre is brought on in Geelong, but it's also important that we support that sector as a whole. Now, it was the spirit of competition and opportunity back then. It was industry-led and government-backed that created the thriving events and exhibition market we saw in Melbourne through the 90s and into the 2000s. But it's often said that complacency can be the greatest killer of competition and enterprise. So we see now that the sector is suffering under what I believe is the complacency of this government after they've been in power now for 10 years. And even with this piece of legislation, they're just dabbling around the edges of legislation instead of introducing real reform that could benefit the sector. Now, we will, on this side, always continue to champion our events and our tourism sector and bring meaningful reforms, and we're going to have a lot more to say in this space. But we've done that here, we've done it at times with our federal colleagues in Canberra, and we've also done it whilst maintaining the support for private industry, for those people who are having a go in the event sector, all of those people that I mentioned, making sure that they are properly supported. Because when we are competitive like that with our government venues, it will continue to pump up the sector, pump up those people and bring the economic benefit to the state. Now, as I said, this government's done little to nothing in the event space, and I'm not talking major events, I'm talking about this event space that I've defined. They have done little to nothing in that space, and they've been more focused on housekeeping around the edges of the legislation. Now, after COVID, of course, the sector demands and deserves more from this government that focuses on just the administrative minutiae of this place. They need a government who comes to the table with reform, who helps deregulate, helps with investment and opportunity and consultations. And I just think at the moment these are qualities that are missing from those on the other side of the chamber, a real vision for this space for Victoria. Now, this bill may seem inconsequential to some, and I think it's that fact that the fact that we're seeing it as inconsequential actually shows that there is a lack of focus from the Minister and the Premier and the departments on the revival of our tourism and events space. You know, we should be talking about proper reform, a restructuring of our agencies that help administer these events. We should be talking about bodies that have a real focus on tourism, that have a real focus on our major events, and have a real focus on business events here in Victoria so we can best utilise our assets and show the Victorian people and the world that we truly are the events capital of both Australia, but also keep selling ourselves globally. Now, there's no doubt that the development of regional event centres is commendable, and it's something that we've also been proud of on this side. However, building and administering these centres is not the end of the government's responsibility in these areas. Now, you can't just have a build and run mentality, leaving things like the convention centre or sporting events or tourism centres with developments that just sit there. Now, every time a bill comes before this House in the event space, we do see missed opportunity after missed opportunity. Geelong itself is one of the fastest growing cities in Australia, but thanks to this government's focus on Melbourne and inside the train tracks, and we've seen a number of projects, and I'll touch on some of those that have been listed for Geelong that have been cancelled in recent times. We need to make sure that we are delivering not just for Melbourne, not for just the people here, but also for regional Victoria. And the biggest one that comes to mind in recent times, that promise for regional Victoria, of course, is the Commonwealth Games, where people in Geelong and in other regional centres were promised a Games for regional Victoria. They were promised a Games that was going to bring the eyes of the world to those centres, and all that they ended up getting was a $600 million bill for the Victorian taxpayer, a Games that is going to be held somewhere possibly in Scotland using Victorian taxpayers' money, and projects that now will be delivered because the government feels like they have to deliver $1 billion worth of infrastructure for something, in some cases, that isn't actually needed. Now, we don't want to see that happen with this centre, so I hope the government does have a plan on how they're going to actually increase the events sector and bring events to Geelong, because we don't want to see it just sit there. Now, I did mention earlier there was a couple of concerns in and around the bill, and one of those relates to the newly renamed trust membership, or the new trust being moved from 7 to 9 members. This was raised in the bill briefing by myself and colleagues, and it's been raised by a number of stakeholders. Now, we know the appointment to public boards and trusts is an opportunity to diversify the experience, both professional and lived, being brought to the table to address new issues and challenges. But with the Victorian Convention and Event Trust, it's clear that this new challenge, and with the launch and integration of the Geelong Convention Exhibition Centre into the Trust, we need to make sure that, and this has been raised, as I said, that those 2 extra trustees have some sort of a link to the Geelong area or to the events sector as a whole. And I think the stakeholders locally both would like to see probably the first one as much as the second one. So I know it's been mentioned that there's 1 member with a link to Geelong currently in the 7 that sit there now, but we do want to make sure that the people who are going onto that trust do have the best interests of Geelong and a connection to that space, and we have addressed that with the Minister and his office. Look, the government, when we did ask it, they sidestepped and did say they did have 1 member of the board living on Geelong, so we do just continue to encourage them to look at that when they make those appointments. And I'm sure you will receive people from the Geelong area wanting to be put onto this trust once this looks like opening as well. When you talk about the Geelong community, and the government does hold seats down there, and we hope that they're not neglecting that community, but we want to make sure that there is an assurance that the Geelong community is going to be involved in probably what's going to be its largest tourism asset in the area. And this is going to bring a lot of people to the Geelong area, and we want to make sure that they are having that engagement with local communities down there. And we know that with the Commonwealth Games, there was very, very limited local consultation, and we've been out there many times in that community and gone and seen a lot of the local sports, a lot of the venues, a lot of the people involved who said they were just told that this was going to happen. There was very, very little consultation, and then even after the cancellation, very little consultation to make sure the assets that are being delivered as a result of the cancellation as a result of the government's spend in the future, that they're not just getting assets that are being delivered because the government promised them for games, but they are actually what is needed by those local communities. So we want to make sure that consultation continues. Another one of the concerns I think that Geelong is facing when it comes to a venue of this size and the people it's going to deliver is actually making sure the connectivity of that city is matching of the demand of the people who are going there. So things like public transport and access to Geelong become a lot more important, and we know that Melbourne Airport is slated to get a third runway, and we now see that Melbourne Airport Rail is going to go ahead after a number of years of fights and probably, an extra cost that's going to be put onto delivering that as a project now. But once people fly into Melbourne or into Avalon, we've got to make sure that they can then get from those airports out to this big convention centre and make sure the accessibility for those people when they're going there is applicable. So when you talk about that, it's probably disappointing to see that Labor's commitment to Geelong Fast Rail has been shelved or cancelled. It was another election promise to the people of Geelong or to Victoria that was, in all honesty, probably nothing more than an empty commitment that was designed to win a bunch of votes in regional Victoria, a little bit like, I keep mentioning it, the Commonwealth Games was. And we know at the time, then Premier Daniel Andrews and the now Premier, who was the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, Premier Jacinta Allen now, declared that the 250-kilometre-an-hour trains were set to be the fastest in Australia and would slash travel times. And less than 18 months later, the project was scrapped. There was little to no substantial work commenced on that, and it seems was just another empty press release from this government. Now, the fast rail commitment came along with other promises for Geelong. Yes, the convention centre and a children's hospital. Now, at the moment, it only looks like the convention centre will be delivered, and as I said, we hope that that is on time. But I guess the question that comes from locals now is, will it be delivered, when and for what price? Now, this government, they're happy to focus on their massive metro projects, and we've heard more about it today with the metro rail, and it doesn't matter that it's a secret letter that's going to reveal another $888 million in cost for the people of Victoria just to try to get that delivered on time. But when it comes to regional Victoria and to Geelong, they've only been too happy to announce things and then scrap or shelve, and the Geelong Fast Rail is an example of that. Now, the success of any event centre is dependent on the ability for attendees to access the centre readily from anywhere in the state, or interstate or internationally. So I would hope that there is a focus on understanding by 2026 how we're going to get all these people out to Geelong in the best way possible, and not just putting more buses on roads out through Western Melbourne and out to Geelong. We want to make sure there is investment in rail connectivity to Geelong. We want to see an expansion of the road network, and also I think some private sector investment absolutely will be critical in trying to get this done. And we also want to make sure that when people are in Geelong, and we actually heard a little bit of this around consultations prior to the Commonwealth Games being cancelled, that the Geelong bus network needs a complete rework as well. As a growing regional city, as the biggest growing regional city here in the state, to make sure that those bus networks, at the moment, you catch a bus out in the suburbs, you go into the city interchange, and then you go back out again. There's going to have to be more bus connectivity around Geelong, because once people get down there, they're not going to be stuck inside the convention centre. They want to make sure they're going to get out to the rest of the area. Now, I do say there needs to be a real debate about how this government has pushed our regional centres to the side. And I think the other point that we want to see in terms of infrastructure to make sure that this is successful is that Bellarine Link Geelong Ring Road extension, which was announced in 2017, and it's still not funded beyond initial planning and scoping work. So that's 7 odd years ago, and we still haven't seen that go ahead. Another thing that was raised in terms of questions about this bill was about how the reporting for each convention centre will be presented. Now, with the addition of the Geelong Convention Centre, it does really give the government a monopoly on large conferences and the large conference sector here in Victoria, but it also means there'll be more competition than ever between these two venues, I would hope. And competition, I know on this side of the house we believe so, but competition is a good thing. Competition is a good thing. So some of the stakeholders and members on this side have queried that, will there be separate annual reporting for each venue to make sure that we can actually see the commercial performance and competition between these venues is taking place, and there is transparency around that as well. Unsurprisingly, I guess the questions about this expectation there are questions about the statement of expectation from the Minister related to these venues, and we know, of course, that the Minister will provide his written expectations for the Trust overall, as we were told, but with such important venues under its purview, it seems clear that a statement of expectation for each one would be enormously beneficial. So maybe just something for the Minister to think about. Obviously, he will write that for the Trust, but if he can do for both and set clear guidelines for what each of these convention centres wants to achieve, I think that would be beneficial to all Victorians. Now, they're complex venues, they're operating in a tangled web of commercial competition and bureaucracy, and as I said, the Minister should be outlining the government's expectation in relation to each facility, or, will this Minister shy away from setting those specific KPIs? We just want to see that he does that. Now, these are important projects for Victorians, and I think Victorians deserve to know that they're working properly. And yeah, I just think reporting procedures for these venues, separate reporting will be important. Now, this convention centre also has already, in line with most other government projects here in Victoria, seen its share of blowouts. So we've seen $160 million in blowout already through the build of this convention centre, and we're still a couple of years off at opening. It's not the only blowout the government has tried to distract us from or has seen since its time on the government benches over there in the last 10 years, but $163 million so far, the cost of building this new Geelong Convention Centre has gone up, and we also know there is a whole list that the Shadow Minister for Finance, the member for Kew, found in a recent FOI document, a whole range of government blowouts across a number of smaller projects. We all know the major projects in Victoria that have blown out in the more than $40 billion of cost blowouts across those, but I think that it's the smaller, I say smaller, $163 million is not a small amount, it's not a small amount of money, but it's the smaller blowouts that are starting to really add up in this state, and I think that people are starting to question, especially with what we've seen recently with the CFMEU, the industrial action today, are the Victorian taxpayers being taken for a ride? And when you go through the more than 100 government contracts for capital works have been varied over the last couple of years, and just to name a few, I don't want to go through these. I've got pages and pages of these blowouts, but things like the Victoria Commission office refurb, the Sunshine Law Courts redevelopment, the Ballarat Station upgrade, the glass house replacement in Horsham, Balnarring Primary School in your electorate, Acting Speaker, had a cost blowout. The recycled water in Kyneton, the Shepparton Youth Prevention Hub. We've got just $1.4 million for facade upgrades and restoration at Little Motlop Street in Geelong. It just continues to add up. All of these cost blowouts continue to add up. So another $163 million. We just hope that we don't see that number going up as we go through and get closer to this being delivered. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but if you want to discuss broken promises and cost blowouts, I mean, especially one that was directly related to Geelong, the $600 million wasted on cancelling the Commonwealth Games has to be right at the top of that list. And we know that the Auditor General described the significant waste of taxpayer money as being, and the government's costings as being overstated and not transparent, and that's not something uncommon for this government, and overstated because it doubled the count's costs relating to industrial action risks and cost escalation risks. Now, We just want to make sure as we move forward, the tourism, the events, the sporting sector, the major events, our events sector are all supported properly. The government does their proper work on business cases, on planning, on building, and we don't want to see another white elephant out in regional Victoria like the Commonwealth Games was. You know, the Premier has described herself as one not to cut and run when challenges get hard, but as I said, she's bungled Airport Rail. The suburban rail loop keeps going up and up and up, and we have no idea how the government's going to build that. The Commonwealth Games is a debacle. We just want to make sure that the tourism, our major events, our events sector as a whole are being supported properly. But after 10 years of this government, I just struggle to see how. I did mention before that there is that the government will have a monopoly now on the major convention and events industry now with the building of this, and there has been some concern raised by the hotel sector. Now, we know most of our major hotels here in Melbourne have convention spaces, have conference spaces, mostly sort of between that 100 to 400 sort of person range. Now, they are in direct competition already with the government when it comes to the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre, and there is some concern from the industry, from that private sector, that now they are going to be outbid on a lot of these smaller events. They're hoping that the government will stick in their lane, and I guess the MCB will stick in their lane when it comes to those larger style events and still allow the private sector, who's going to see 28% more hotel stock come online in sort of the next year or so here in Melbourne, that they've still got the opportunity to bid and not be outbid consistently by these larger event centres, that they continue to try to attract larger conferencing and events to Melbourne and to Geelong, but the hotels can keep doing the work that they do, because we do want to make sure, the CBD is struggling, we do want to make sure that that private sector is important. We need those hotels online. We need them for when our major events do happen. We do need them during the tennis. We do need them during the Grand Prix, but they survive through Q2 and Q3 by running these smaller style conferencing events. And I also think that the government needs to do more in trying to work with that private sector, with those hotels, to make Q2 and Q3, so those winter months when less people are coming for our major events. Yes, footy's going on, but it's people coming in and out from the suburbs, going to the MCG or to Marvel Stadium, that we've got actually events happening within those hotels. So yeah, just a concern that the monopoly on the conferencing events with those multiple venues now may drive some of that private sector investment or competition into the grounds. So I also just want to say that the other thing this government needs to do, and it's one thing to build an asset, but you need to make sure you keep funding the industry properly. And we saw in the budget this year a huge cut to the tourism and major event space, to the event space. 60% of that budget cut out, more than $280 million from last budget for that sector. And make no mistake, it is an unprecedented cut caused by the financial mismanagement of the Allen Labor government. It is an absolute disgrace that we have money being cut out from destination marketing at a time when we have fallen behind Sydney, we have fallen behind Queensland in terms of our tourism numbers, those numbers coming to Victoria. We are recovering slower than every other state in terms of pre-COVID. We are falling behind. Other than the Northern Territory, we're recovering slower than every other mainland state in Australia. We've got to make sure we keep investing properly in our tourism, our major events and our events sector, and that's through destination marketing. We also know that Western Australia has made, in its most recent budget, a huge investment in this space, record investment, and we don't want to see anything going interstate. We want to make sure that people keep coming here and our events keep coming here. But when you've got Western Australia going and investing $200+ million in destination marketing, in major events funds, you've got Queensland, who are going to spend more in the last 3 months on their Bluey campaign around tourism than we're due to spend in the next 3 years in our destination marketing. You've got to be concerned about the future of our tourism and our events in Victoria, because when that investment is being made elsewhere and not here, people have options now. So, look, we can spend a lot of time, and this government spends a lot of time talking about the events that we retain. We've got to be spending more time thinking about how we can keep pushing forward, because if you're not going forward, you're going backwards. So while we won't be opposing this bill, We won't be opposing this bill. We just want to see the government doing more in this space and investing properly in our events sector.